Hey guys, I'm Dave Trull and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Years ago I made my first tenoning jig and it ran in the miter slot and was fairly easy to adjust. It was also a pain in the butt too. There were lots of adjustments which meant lots of things to check. So when it came time to build a new tenoning jig, I took some cues from some designs I'd seen online and built my own. Made with some scraps of 3/4 inch plywood and a toggle clamp, I made this quick and simple jig that's easy to use. Let's see how that came together. I started with some scraps of 3/4 inch birch plywood and ripped it to 7 inches. That seemed large enough to handle the vast majority of tenons that I'd cut. The height of the front strip was based on the height of my table saw fence. In the case of the Bosch worksite table saw, the fence is right about 2 13/16 of an inch high. I didn't want my jig to drag on the table, so I cut the front at 2 11/16, just tall enough to give me a little clearance. The next piece to work on is the top. The width isn't really critical as long as it's wide enough. That width is based on the thickness of the fence, plus 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood and, well, maybe a little more. My fence is 1 3/4 of an inch wide, plus the 2 sides of the jig and a little extra gave me a top piece that was 3 1/4 inches wide. If it hangs over the back a little, that's perfectly fine. The width of the third piece, or the back, again isn't critical. The important thing is that you cut it smaller than the height of your fence. I cut mine so it was 7 by 2 1/4 inches. Now it's time to put it together. I set the front piece on my table saw and added some glue to the top and held them together while I checked for square. Once I was happy with the alignment, I tacked them together with a few 1 3/16 23 gauge pin nails. I checked for square before shooting in each pin. Now I could add the back that holds the jig on the fence. I didn't want it too tight, so I added a piece of paper to act as a thin spacer. After adding some glue to the top of the back piece and lining it up with the top of the jig, I held it in place and clamped the 2 faces of the assembly to the fence. I added a few more pin nails to hold everything together until the glue dried. Once the paper is removed, you can see how smoothly the jig slides, but there's no play in it. It just rides snugly on the fence. I took a few minutes to sand the entire jig, including rounding over the outer corners. Pay special attention to the face of the jig to ensure that the top doesn't protrude. If it does, it will interfere with squaring your stock when you're cutting your tenons. The last piece to add is the upright fence. I made mine 7 inches high and 1 3/4 wide. Again, these dimensions aren't critical. This is tall enough to support my stock and wide enough to hold a clamp. And it's also an offcut from one of the other pieces. I used a shim to lift the upright fence off the table and then clamped it in place. Once I was happy that it sat square to the table, I added a few pins to secure it. I made sure that none of the pins were in the path of a future blade pass, keeping them at least 1.5 inches up from the table. This should be high enough since I rarely cut tenons deeper than 1.25 inches. I grabbed the toggle clamp out of storage and laid out the holes for the screws that would not only hold the clamp to the fence, but help hold the upright fence to the jig. I didn't glue the fence on as it'll need to be replaced over time. Then I fastened the toggle clamp in place with 1.25 inch wood screws, checking for square before setting the other 3. Again, it's important to keep these screws above any cuts you may make later. Earlier I had cut the shoulders of my tenons using a crosscut table on my table saw and crosscut sled with a stop block, but that's another video. Now I could set my blade height to come up just shy of the shoulder cuts. I also could set my fence so that my first cut was just wider than my tenon.
I like my waste to fall away from the blade, so I set up my jig to hold the stock to the right side of the blade. Remember that it's easier to sneak up on cuts than it is to repair a tenon that's too small. Trust me. The jig keeps your stock square to the table, and the toggle clamp locks it in tightly. Make one pass, then flip the stock to cut the other side. If the tenon is too thick, adjust your fence. But just remember that you're cutting both sides, so make tiny adjustments. You can also adjust the height of your blade so that the cheek and shoulders have a nice crisp edge. A good fit is one that takes a little oomph to slide the tenon into the mortise. Not a struggle, just snug. If your tenon is too loose, you'll end up with a sloppy joint that's going to fail over time. One of the nice things about this design is that my upright fence is 3/4 of an inch wide, like most of the stock that I'll be tenoning. The fence not only holds your piece square, but acts like a zero clearance backer. Because the stock is supported, the blade won't leave any tear out as it leaves the cut. If your fence gets chewed up or you make different width tenons, you can replace your fence and keep that zero clearance feature. One other hint while using this jig is pull the jig back far enough so that the bottom of your stock is touching the saw table every time. If your throat plate sits lower than your saw table, that could affect the depth of your cuts. By always registering off the saw table, you'll get good, repeatable cuts each time.
This simple project can help you create some fantastic joinery and do it safely. Perhaps I'll do a follow-on video on how I cut my mortises, but for now at least you know how to cut some tenons. I'll make a set of plans for this jig, and once it's complete, I'll put the link down below. It'll have specific measurements for the Bosch saw, but I will also explain how to adapt it to any saw fence you have. If you enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up and share it with friends. If you haven't already, maybe hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. Got some interesting things coming along, and you don't want to miss those. So for now, stay safe, take care. We'll see you soon.